Hello everyone, welcome to this month's Tudor Talk. I can see there's some people in the house already. Hello, lovely Fran and Janice, how wonderful to see you here. So Fran, excited about today's Tudor Talk. And Janice say, hi Fran, we've got a nice little community, haven't we, going on, us three ladies. And I thought, Fran is saying my first ever live chat via YouTube. Well, great that you're here, ladies. And I thought I hadn't seen you live, Fran, before, so it's a huge, big welcome to you. Yes, Tudor Talk is my chance to go in depth with historians and curators and authors as we explore a particular topic that we're putting under the spotlight. And if it hasn't escaped your attention today, it is, of course, the 1st of June. And so it is, of course, Anne Boleyn's coronation day. And my guest today was on Instagram Live just a couple of weeks back, talking to us about Anne Boleyn on the anniversary of her execution. So it's so much better to have her back today when we can be in a little more of a joyous and an uplifted mood and celebrate a moment of Anne's triumph. And we are here today, of course, with the lovely Kate McCaffrey, who I shall be bringing on screen in a moment. And we'll be talking about, all things Boleyn, all things Anne, what's going on at Hever. You can ask her anything you like. She's a font of information. So if you do have any questions, get ready to type those in and I will be more than happy to put those to Kate. So these sessions usually run up to about an hour. They usually fly by. So we'll just see how we go. But I think really there's no other housekeeping for today. So I think we can rock and roll and get straight on. And let me bring our guest on to the screen. Hello, Kate.
Hello, thank you for having me on. It's lovely to be here.
You're fine. That's fine. Now, can everybody hear us okay? That's the only thing I want to just check from everybody, because I just got a little message then about something being muted. So just let me unmute that. Hopefully that is all okay. Oh, hello. Right, okay. So I hope I haven't been too muted, but even if I have been muted, the most important person who is here for me today isn't. So Kate, obviously Assistant Curator at Hever Castle, thank you so much for joining us again. As I say, we were on our Instagram Live recently. Thank you so much for being back here to talk to us today about all things Boleyn.
You're so welcome. As you said in just your introduction, it's a much happier occasion to be talking today than it was the last time we spoke on Instagram Live, which was obviously the anniversary of Anne's execution. So it's nice to be here under more joyous circumstances.
Do you feel a weight on that day? How's it for you, particularly at Hever? I know when I first got involved with doing writing the novel and then sort of being on social media, I found those couple of weeks running up to that day just so weighty. And I'm wondering what it's like for you guys actually at Hever.
Absolutely. I think the mood completely changes in the lead up to it. I think, to be honest, as soon as we hit May, it's always those anniversaries start coming in, whether it's the arrest and then it's George and then it's Anne and the other men, of course, as well. It's a really hard month, I think, in many ways, because I think a lot of us who study Anne feel very close to her. And so, of course, we're emotionally involved as well. And that time of year is always carries a lot of weight. And in the castle itself, on the day of, we do once a year flick her books of hours to her inscription page. And when we sort of process in to do that in the morning, it's always very emotional. And we go in as a group and flick the page, and it's sort of like our version of memorializing her on that day. But it's certainly an emotional occasion.
Yeah, I can really, really imagine that. Because it's become such a ritual to do flick that page. It becomes so deeply associated and connected with her. So yeah. Do you, and I'm going to ask you another very general question, which I wasn't expecting to ask you actually, Kate, but I'm going to anyway. Do you ever get a sense of the Boleyns around Hever?
Oh, this is a good question. I mean, Yeah, in many ways, yes. I think you are literally walking in their footsteps when we walk around the castle. And I think that's what's so brilliant about it, is that the castle has changed very little over the last 500 years. So much of what we still see in terms of the structure of the building is as the Boleyns would have known it, which is a really special kind of path to take for us and for visitors alike. So they are everywhere in many ways. And I mean, I personally haven't had any specific ghostly experiences, but I've heard of a lot who have,
Really?
including some of my colleagues. And I have to say, there are certain parts of the castle which you go into and you just feel cold automatically. And I'm one of the people who has to lock up the place at night time. And it's one of my least favorite jobs when it's dark at 3 p.m. in the
Yeah.
winter and you're on your own. That's certainly when you start to feel things more viciously, I would say.
Mm. Okay, thank you for answering that, because it's an interesting question. People feel very differently about that kind of experience. Some
Yeah.
people feel it very acutely. Some people don't really kind of connect with that kind of thing. So thank you for answering that for us. But as I mentioned, it's the anniversary of Anne's coronation. It's the pinnacle of her success. Which is this one of your favourite events in Anne's life, or do you have another or something else that's more kind of close to your heart?
Goodness, that's a really good question. I think there's several dates and kind of times that stand out for me in Anne's life. And the coronation is one of them, definitely. I think for Anne herself, she didn't get to much more of a triumphant moment than when she's being crowned. And obviously, she's pregnant at this point, 6 months pregnant with who becomes Elizabeth I, but what is hoped at this point to be that longed for male heir. So I don't think Anne herself would have felt much more triumphant than on this day all those years ago. But I also love when Elizabeth is born in September. That's another date that I always think of because I love those connections that are drawn between mother and daughter and that we see brilliantly across a range of materials that still exist today. So I always love Elizabeth's birthday. And also, I think the 1522 Chateau Vert is also something that always sticks in my head, that brilliant pageant when we have Anne making her first court recorded appearance back in England. And really, that's where everything began, her whole story in England and her whole relationship with Henry and with the court. That's where we see those remnants beginning. So there are a couple of dates that I love.
Oh, that's lovely. And then maybe Fran, Janice, and I think we have one other person watching us. Maybe you can tell us which is your favourite event while we're chatting away, and I'll be sure to share those. I know Fran's just said, I love the sharing about the spirits. I believe in that.
There's lots of ghost stories, I have to say.
We almost should have like a Halloween special where we do ghost stories from Hever. How about that?
Gosh, there's stories for days. There really are. We've got a whole booklet of where we record them just to keep as
Really?
memories. Yeah, because so many visitors and staff alike. So it's important to
Yeah.
remember them.
Yeah, lovely, lovely. So maybe we should turn our attention to Hever and what's going on in the present day and some of the research behind that. And then perhaps we can come on and talk like what's coming down the line as well. And in the interim, if we get sidetracked into talking about various aspects of the Boleyn's life at Hever, well, so be it. But you've got an exhibition running on there at the moment, and that's Katherine and Anne, Queen's Rivals Mothers, right?
Yes, that's absolutely it. Yeah, so we launched that back in February and it's running until November. And it focuses on, as the name would suggest, Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn, so Henry's first two wives. And we're trying to really challenge those traditional narratives that pit the two women against one another, because to be honest, I think they're rooted in a lot of patriarchal ideals that aren't as relevant anymore. And I think we need to really reassess how we see these women outside of Henry's gaze and outside of his story. It's a little bit post Six the musical era that we're trying to bring back these women's voices. And we've been able to do that primarily through the two prayer books that we have on display, which brilliantly has been part of my own research, my personal research with Anne's books of hours. And we've been able to reunite Catherine of Aragon and Anne's books of hours under the same roof for the first time in likely 500 years since their original production and use. So that's been really, really special. And speaking of emotions, watching those two books be installed next to each other in the castle was one of the highlights of my career so far. It was just beautiful to see them reunited. And we're using that as a real catalyst, I think, to, as I said, re-examine what we know of their relationship, because they did share a lot in common. It wasn't just one prayer book that they shared in common, or just a husband. They were both brilliantly formidable and intelligent and stubborn and fiery. And I think you really could say Henry had a type. So being able to explore that in our exhibition has been really special. And we actually take that through to their daughters, to Mary and Elizabeth as well. In the latter half of the exhibit, we look at the equally complex relationship between their daughters, who were obviously England's first two queens regnant. You actually, unfortunately, only have 3 more days now to see Katherine of Aragon's Book of Hours before it goes back to its home in New York in the Morgan Library. And then we'll have a couple of days of an empty case while we prepare for our new item that's replacing Katherine's, and that will be launching on the 8th, so actually a week today. And there'll be a lot of research coming out alongside that, which we're really excited to share.
So I know we can't talk about that at the moment because there's a bit of an embargo on it. So we might be a week early. Maybe we should have done this next week. But nevertheless,
I'll come back.
but let's talk a little bit more about the prayer books, because when did you first come across the existence of Katherine's prayer book? Because obviously I primarily met you through the research you were doing, first and foremost, on Anne's prayer books. At some point along the way, you came across Katherine's prayer book. How did that happen, and what was that moment of connection like for you, where you saw the similarities, or the connection between the two?
It's a really, really good question. I can remember very specifically the moment that I came across Katherine's and put the two together. I was actually sitting in a cafe on my university campus, and I thought, am I imagining this? Like, could this really not have been picked up on before, that the two queens owned the same prayer book? But wonderfully, it hadn't. Wonderfully for me. So yes, it was actually through reading Eamon Duffy's brilliant book called Marking the Hours, which is all about books of hours and the process of people writing in them primarily. And I read a description. He has a small description, probably just a couple of sentences, describing Katherine of Aragon's Book of Hours that is in the Morgan Library. And I thought it sounded remarkably similar to the one we have at Hever and to the one that I had just worked with in person. So this was probably in January of 2020, so a good 3.5 years ago now, which is crazy. And I thought, that sounds remarkably similar. So I reached out to the curators there at the Morgan, John McQuillan, who was very, very helpful. And it was actually during the first lockdown of the pandemic. So it was very hard to kind of access archival records. We were working with what we could online. And John managed to get into the library during one of New York's lockdowns, which was very kind of him, to take pictures of the book for me. And when he sent them through, I was able to compare them with the images I had of Anne's book. And it was immediately clear that they were, in fact, one and the same, even just from the title page in both of them, which declares, the date and the printer and the location.
Right, okay, that's interesting, because I wanted to ask you that. When you said the same, I was like, is that the same author? Is that the exact same version? When you're talking same, but it sounds like it's the same, basically.
Definitely, yes. It's the same printing. So these books would have been printed in batches, maybe from anything from around 6 to 15 to maybe even 20. But these were very highly personalized, so they would have probably been printed in a smaller batch. But it's the same text that's completely printed in each one, which is largely Latin prayers and psalms, but does have a few English prayers in them, interestingly. And then the illuminations are woodcuts, so they're all printed again the same. They all have the same stencil to work with. And then they're hand illuminated, which does make them sort of a cut above the rest compared to your cheaper printings. So these were expensive printings. They were printed on parchment as well, not paper. So there's gold leaf involved as well. So there's kind of extra levels where you know that this was destined for a high audience.
It made me sort of think then when you were talking, Henry VIII ordered a batch to send. I've got a couple of queens.
Yeah, exactly.
I'll have a job lot, please. No, but okay, so that is obviously a very flippant comment on my part. I just going to share a couple of comments, and then I
Yes,
definitely have another question for you on this very thing. So we were asking about favourite Anne Boleyn moments, and Janice said that Anne's coronation has to be my favourite. I love the dramatisation. Oh, during the recent summit. Thank you, Janice. That's very kind of you to mention the summit. And she's also can't wait to hear what's coming on the 8th at Hever. And Fran is saying, I now need to go to the Morgan Library to see Catherine's prayer book. That's a good point. Can you get access to it?
So I believe it's not actually on permanent display in the Morgan. It's in their collection, but I think you have to reach out in advance to ask to view it. So it's absolutely worth, looking through their catalogue online. They've got also all sorts of treasures. So if you were there, you'd want to see lots of different things, but this would be one, absolutely. And there's some brilliant bits to it that we haven't been able to display, some notes and fun little drawings and things that would be great to see in person.
Oh, that's wonderful. Because I was going to, I've got 2 questions I need to ask you. First of all, I was going to ask, has Katherine doodled in her book like Anne did? That was my first question. And the second question is, I found it interesting that they both have the same book of hours, considering they had slightly different religious inclinations. But is that uncommon? Common? Is there any comment around that?
Yeah, that's a really important point. But I'll just start with the doodles of Katherine. Yes. She actually, sadly, didn't make any marks in the book herself that can be attributed to her. She didn't sign her name on anything. But the leaves in the book are a lot more embellished and written on than in Anne's book, for example. So it's passed through a lot more hands of people who have added their own notes. And we actually know it was Katherine of Aragon's because of an inscription by the woman who she passed the book to after her ownership. And that was one of her ladies in waiting, Margaret Pennington Cook. And so she writes in it, she says that this book was given to me by good Queen Catherine. And I'm passing it to my daughter. She passes it to her daughter called Beatrice. And it kind of passes down. And someone's written a really lovely, quite a chunky paragraph, really, of provenance text in terms of saying it went from this person then to this person.
Oh, brilliant.
So it's really useful. And it also passed through a few hands of several archbishops as well, and priors and religious institutions. So obviously people who were loyal to Catherine and to Catholicism through Catherine, they're the ones who kept it safe, which is quite a nice parallel to Anne Boleyn's book being kept safe by women and people close to her who loved her. So they both survived, but for similar reasons. And sorry, the next question.
Yeah, was the religious differences and why they've got the same book.
Yeah, so it's a really, really important point, and one that kind of puzzles a lot of people, I think, and is still one that I'm working through myself. But I think the presence of Anne as someone who we associate more with religious reform, the presence of her engaging with at least 3 books of hours, actually. So we have the 2 at Hever, and there's one in the British Library, King's MS9, which she's written in as well. So she engaged with at least 3 books of hours, which are traditionally Catholic texts. And that is a little bit confusing, I think, for what we know about Anne and her religious preferences. But I think it offers an important insight that maybe hasn't been considered as much as it should have been previously, which is the pace of Anne's religious development. We're not necessarily saying, I think, that she became reformist overnight in France, and she was definitely that way when she came back to England, because here she is engaging with Catholic texts well into the late 1520s, which is much more when we associate her with exploring reform. And I'm not saying at all that she wasn't a patron of religious reform, because she absolutely was, and she was a passionate believer in evangelical reform, non-schismatic evangelical reform. But she obviously engaged with a wide variety of texts, I think, in order to know where she wanted to orient herself with religious belief. I think Anne's interest in religious reform was rooted deeply in her genuine interest in Christianity in general, first and foremost. She had to know about Catholicism in order to know what she wanted to reform about it. So she was afraid to read. Yeah, she wasn't afraid to read all these texts from all ends of the spectrum and engage with them and then figure out where she stood. And I think that speaks a lot to how pious she was and how dedicated she was to truly finding her place in this very tumultuous time of religious change.
And I love that, actually. I hadn't thought about it in that way. But, you hear people these days, don't you, with social media talking about how we operate in our own little echo chambers, and people are not
Yes.
prepared to entertain a kind of spectrum of ideas, to explore them and challenge themselves. So the fact that we've got Anne doing that just adds another dimension to her character, as far as I'm concerned.
It really does. I think that's exactly it. And it totally speaks to her being a genuinely pious individual, which I think, again, is often lost over the centuries and through some popular culture sort of depictions of Anne, where
Mm,
she's maybe slightly more frivolous. But she really
mm,
was very dedicated to her
yeah.
own religious beliefs and very educated.
So let me bring Janice's comment onto the screen if I can. How much would these books have cost in the 16th century? Do we know?
Yeah, that's a brilliant question. And I can't tell you the answer for sure. Unfortunately, we don't have receipts for these kinds of books that exist, but they would have been very expensive. There would have been a kind of scale from these cheap printings, which would have been printed on paper with no hand embellishment or probably no color or no paint. And then you get to the kind of higher end scale of the printings, which these ones fall into, where a lot of extra care has gone into their production. Even the parchment is polished, it's all set for this higher clientele. And then obviously manuscripts were the most expensive form of books at this point. So they were ones that were completely handwritten by scribes. So that kind of falls into the higher end of the lower spectrum, if that makes sense. But this still would have cost an arm and a leg. And if I say that only royals or nobles would have been able to afford a book like this. This was not a book that would have been bought by anyone below the aristocracy. It was that expensive.
Mm. I'm asking you a very general question again, just my curiosity leading me. Handwritten manuscripts, books of hours. When was the last one written like that? Was it during the Tudor period? Did they go
Yes.
into the Stuart period and later in the 17th century?
Well, books of hours themselves sort of fade out of production by the time of Elizabeth's reign. They're sort of quite unfashionable by the time Elizabeth first comes to the throne. They've had their peak mainly in the kind of medieval, early modern era. But manuscript production, and again, it's a really good point, it really does continue. It doesn't stop at all, as some people might think when the printing press arrives in the West in that sort of mid 15th century. Manuscripts still continue to be produced, but it does reduce slightly. And manuscripts, again, they're still being produced today. They never go away fully, but in the Tudor era, they start to diminish in popularity purely because print is so accessible. But manuscript culture really influences print culture, and these books are a perfect example of that because although they're printed, they're hand decorated and hand embellished. And so that's kind of printers nodding to manuscript culture and trying to create a book that has the look of a manuscript, but for a slightly more reasonable price.
Okay. So thank you for that. And Janice also says, thank you, Kate, for your reply there. So as you mentioned, that manuscript book, that book of hours is going back, and you've
Yeah.
got a new artifact coming in, and I know you can't say a lot about it. Can you tease us at all about it?
It's something that's very much in the same theme as the topics that we've been discussing in the exhibition, but it is to do with a new character. I will say that we're adding a new character into the midst, a new character who is related to both Katherine and Anne, and who is very much around at this point and tied to their stories. And it's something that I am under embargo about, which is why I cannot spill more beans. But it's something that I think will cause a few waves and lots of questions. What's been really exciting about the process is Owen and I have been researching it for over a year now, and we just keep coming up with more questions than answers,
Oh,
which
that
is
sounds.
the nature of research, really. But it's something that will be ongoing beyond just next week.
So this is going to be such a hard question. I'm being so unfair by asking you this, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Of the two artifacts, which are you most excited about having? If you could only choose one,
Between Catherine's and our new one,
and the new one.
Oh, this is really mean, Sarah. I would say it took me about 3 years to get Catherine's book over here from New York. So I think that was the one that really was just cost me so much personally. But to be honest, I think right now I'm more excited about the one next week. Can I get an answer?
Okay.
Back in February, I was more excited
I
about
was going to
Catherine.
say, yeah, it's like people ask me so often, Kate, what's your favourite places to visit? And I always say the one I'm about to go to, or the one I've.
That's a great answer. It's a great answer because it
And it's
changes.
true. It's so true. I mean, I hear myself saying so often, oh, this is so my favourite. Because at that point it genuinely is, because it has grabbed my interest and I've got into it and I've learned more about it and I've had my eyes open. So I'm going to accept that answer.
Thank you.
Okay, well, let's move on and talk a little bit, if we could, about maybe what's coming next year and about the kind of recent research on the castle itself, because you had Simon Thurley do some work. And I
Yeah.
think it's really, for those of us who love visiting Hever, who want to sort of transport ourselves in our imagination and reimagine, it'd be lovely for you to highlight maybe what some of the new work has pulled out, and maybe what that's going to lead on to, possibly.
Definitely. This I can talk more about. So that's absolutely fine. Yes, we had, as you mentioned, Professor Simon Thurley came to Hever actually just before the pandemic, so a good few years ago now, to do an architectural survey of the castle, which we weirdly enough haven't had done, as far as I'm aware, ever, or in a very long time at least. So it was really brilliant to bring him on board as such an authority. He used to run English Heritage, and he's got a great architectural historian reputation behind him. So he brought his own wealth of knowledge and expertise, and him and his team took a while to put together a report for us, and we now are using that report, which confirmed a lot of things that we had suspected or hoped for about the castle and completely challenged others.
Can you do a couple of things for us, Kate, before you go any further? Can you just explain what an architectural historian actually would do? So he turns up with his clipboard.
Yeah.
What happens? What do they do? What are they looking for? And then maybe you could talk a little bit to that point about what it confirmed and maybe what it challenged.
Definitely, yes. So architectural historians focus on the structures of the buildings. So they are looking at the building without the human element behind it. It's more about the structure itself. Whereas Owen and I, for example, come from more of a social history background, social and cultural history, which is more about the people. But architectural histories are looking at the buildings. So it was the perfect kind of person to turn to when we wanted things confirmed about Hever. So, for example, he turned up with a team of people and he had his clipboard, as you said. Lots of
That was a good
photographs.
guess.
Yes, good guess. Lots of photographs were taken and things filmed, but he basically worked his way around the whole castle, all the parts that are behind the ropes. He looked in things that we don't even look in ourselves. You know, it's kind of really in-depth search of the place, behind floorboards, behind panels, like really getting back to the original fabric of the building. That's what he was doing. And then he takes all of that kind of primary information away and he uses archival resources to flesh it out. So what's brilliant is he was working with a lot of local archives around Kent and further afield, but to really kind of piece together Hever's history, not just as a castle, but as a site before the castle was even there. So it's really exciting. And I think the village of Hever have been very excited about it as well, because it's offered a lot more information about the local community and the origins of it. Right. And one of those assumptions or things that we had thought for a long time, for example, was the date of the castle itself, which was quite a shock to all of us when we had it confirmed, when he knocked 100 years off what we thought it was. But we originally had been going with the idea that it was from the 1270s, that our gatehouse was built in the 1270s, and that's the part of the castle that you see most famously in pictures. It's that gorgeous stone exterior. And he came along, and to be fair, others had sort of speculated about it before, that it was later. But he confirmed for us that it is 1383 that the castle was built in. So, yeah, just over 100 years after we had originally thought. But what's brilliant about that is it came with then him going to the archives and fleshing that out to be a story about a man called Cobham who came to Hever, built Hever up, not the De Hevers as we previously thought. They did not build Hever, but the de Cobhams did. So Cobham came to Hever in 1383 and built this hugely fortified castle. And it's all set in the backdrop of the Peasants' Revolt at this time. So he was, interestingly enough, a tax collector. And you can imagine why he would have been a bit unpopular with the peasants at this time. And Kent is all where those kind of anti-nobility sentiments were stirring up in the Peasants' Revolt. So he comes to Hever and creates this heavily fortified castle, I think also partly to show off because he's very wealthy. And there is really no need for him to have had, for example, 3 portcullises on this fairly small castle in kind of the middle of nowhere. So we think a little bit of him was just boasting by saying, look how many portcullises I've got. But so it's brilliant that Simon's been able to take a few years off our history, but flesh it out so it's richer in detail. And I think that's what he's managed to do. And that's what we're hoping to then use as the basis for moving forward with recurating the place, which is the project that we're involved in at the moment. And we launched the first phase of that earlier this year with our ground floor, which we have recurated and represented. And we've opened up a room that's never been opened to the public before, which we call our moat room. Used to be where Owen and I would sometimes squat working in an office, but it's been represented, and it's a room that was actually built by Astor. So on our ground floor, we're really celebrating William Waldorf Astor's use of the castle, purchase of the castle, and its 20th century history, because we do have some brilliantly rich history just from a century ago, which is a really important part of Hever's story to tell. And, you know, if it wasn't for Astor purchasing the castle in 1903, we wouldn't have it today to look around. So we're very grateful to him. And it's important to recognise those people who come in, swoop in and save these places from ruin. And that's why we're lucky enough to still have so many around the country today. But that's why we love the Astors at Hever. So it's been lovely to show their story.
Can you just actually just tell us what kind of state was Hever in when Astor took it over? Was it really dilapidated, or, you know, just a bit unloved, or, you know, what kind of, how close was it to sort of, you know, falling down?
Yes, really good point. And we used to think it was in a state of almost ruin, you know, farm animals being inside and all sorts. And it wasn't quite that bad, but the building had been tenanted for the past several hundred years. There had been no owner who lived in Hever and so gave it the care it needed, really since, well, the 16th century. Since Anne of Cleves, who is another part of Simon's research, which I'm sure we can talk about. But
yeah,
it was really in a state of disrepair, mainly, not necessarily neglect that was deliberate, but just that came from years of no owners being actively involved in keeping it up. It was previously owned before the Astors. It was tenanted by a man called Guy Seabright, and him and his wife really cared about the place, which was lovely to see. He was only there for about 5 or so years, but he started the process of restoration, which Astor then came in and took over and completely saved.
Right. I see. Great. And I will just pause for a moment because we're just over halfway through potentially our chat. We're here till up until 7:30, depending on how much we've got to talk about. So do hello to all those of you who are, a couple of people have joined us. So hello and welcome. We're obviously talking about all things Boleyn and Hever with our lovely guest today, Kate McCaffrey, Assistant Curator from Hever Castle. So please feel free to ask all of those questions that you're dying to ask when you go and look round Hever and you're thinking about the Boleyns and you're thinking about the spaces. I know I've definitely got a question that I know people ask me, so I'm going to ask you at some point when we get there in the castle, because I'm trying to guide Kate on a nice little guided tour of Hever to tell us about all those little things that have been found out in this latest research, or that maybe Astor changed, that, you know, isn't original, but people may want to imagine. Can you talk a little bit about the ground floor and what it would have looked like before Aster came along and did those beautiful rooms? I mean, I just think they're gorgeous, but of course it's not exactly how it was. Can you just talk a little bit about some of the main things that were different during the Boleyns' time at Hever on the ground floor?
Definitely, yes. So the ground floor was actually probably the floor that's changed the most in the castle since the Boleyns' time, because it was the floor that was in the most disrepair. And then we had awful floods in 1958 and 68, so panelling, etc., had to be changed. But in the Boleyns' time, it would have been largely domestic. As you sort of walk into the castle, if you can sort of imagine following me over the drawbridge and you're looking at the castle, the left-hand wing was the family wing. That was the family apartments. They would have had their family offices and estate offices. That's where Thomas would have operated from, with his estate managers. So that's in what's now our library and our morning room. But on the opposite side of the castle, you had the domestic wing, and that's what's now known as our inner hall and our drawing room. And that would have been primarily only for servants. So interestingly enough, our inner hall, which is beautiful when you walk in, it's the first room on the visitor route, but that would have been the kitchens. So it was the great kitchens. They would have had two fireplaces alongside the wall, much less windows. There would have been barely any windows, because the drawing room was also the pantry. It was the buttery as well. So it was where they kept things cool. It's the coolest side of the castle. So that really has changed a lot, but it's a part of the recreation going forward that we wanted to bring back that sense of the domestic and the familial, because it was a really important part of Tudor life. And interestingly enough, there's these trends in Tudor architecture where they're trying to add layers of privacy back in to separate the kind of domestic side of the household to the family side of the household. So a great example of that at Hever is in our beautiful Great Hall, which we know is original thanks to Simon's research, which is brilliant. So it does date back to the 1380s.
Right.
But the Boleyns added in a room behind the Great Hall, which is now known as our morning room, or our parlour, as we're going to rename it. That's what it would have been created to be. So they sectioned off parts of the house that were previously open. And that was for the idea of adding in more layers of privacy. You had to walk through more rooms in order to get to the family apartments. And I think that's what really gives us the sense that Hever was this perfect retreat for the Boleyns, away from the prying eyes of court. Because we think of Hever, I think, as mainly Anne's childhood home, which of course it was in many ways. But she retreats there in the 1520s, in the late 1520s, when there's all this turmoil going on at court, having accepted the king's proposal. You know, she makes that decision to accept the king's proposal at Hever. Then she returns with the sweating sickness in 1528, and she returns to escape from Campeggio with the Legatine court before she then eventually goes back because she couldn't stay away. But she uses Hever as this place to really be private and safe. And I think we really see that through the architectural history of the building, by these rooms being added in and by this privacy being created. So the ground floor, is sort of mapped out like that. It's changed a lot, but it would have been a very special place for Anne and the Boleyns to retreat back to.
Yeah, I love the fact that the Great Hall's original. It's got so much, you can just imagine all that feasting and just wonderful. Now, Fran said, I love hearing about the former kitchens, and also Janice and Fran talking about how much we owe, huge debt of gratitude to the Asters for rescuing that building. Now, moving from the ground floor, one of the things that always I think is interesting to me for some reason is where the staircase used to be. Because normally you would have a staircase going up to the private apartments on the first floor at the high end of the hall. That would be your usual position. Was there ever a staircase there at the high end of the hall?
Well, this is really interesting. And what's brilliant about Simon's report is that he offered us a lot of information we didn't already have, but just on the flip side of that, as with everything, there were also a lot more gaps that we didn't know. We don't quite know where things might have been. And staircases is one of the most confusing things about Hever, because they changed a lot. We had, for example, Anne of Cleves added in a staircase from the entrance hall, which was her creation on the ground floor. Anne of Cleves added our entrance hall. She added one up to the middle floor apartments. And the Boleyns themselves, we know, added the small spiral staircase, which visitors now walk up to get to Anne's bedroom, or what's called Anne's bedroom. That was Thomas and Elizabeth, likely. So we know where certain ones were, but we can't for sure say if there was one that went up to the far end of the hall. So it's really interesting, and it's something that Alison, Owen and myself are constantly getting headaches over, trying to picture exactly what everything was. So yes, it's the still little bits that are slightly escapable from us, but we have the overall vision.
That's really interesting. So we're up on the first floor, which for many Boleyn fans gets to be one of the most exciting areas, because we're in that part of the house, as you said, that the family would have lived in, that big sort of solar room. Let's try and get as clear as possible about what's going on that first floor. And particularly people ask me, where were the Boleyns sleeping? Where would Anne have slept? Where would Thomas and Elizabeth have slept? So what's our absolute latest thinking about the arrangement of space on that first floor?
Yeah, and bedrooms are always something that really interests people, and I love that.
Yeah.
Obviously, the first room that you enter as you go up the spiral staircase to our first floor is traditionally known as Anne's bedroom. And we're sure that there is some, that myth has come from somewhere. These things never just spring up out of nowhere. So it's absolutely possible that it was a bedroom. But it's bedrooms in this time weren't necessarily fixed, they were a bit more fluid. So there would have been a best bedchamber, which we do have, and that's further on as you go down. But that's likely where Thomas and Elizabeth stayed. It's in where our Queen's Chamber, we call it now. And it's been redressed as a bedchamber for our exhibition this year, and it will be continued to be redressed as a bedroom going forward. But the first bedroom, I think, could have possibly been where Anne and her sister slept. Everyone remarks that it's a slightly smaller room, but women were, and young girls were given smaller rooms, single young women. George probably had his own room, but Anne and Mary likely shared together, and probably with their governesses as well. So it's absolutely possible that they slept in that first room or in the solar itself, which was also used for sleeping. Again, these spaces were very changeable. They could be one thing by day, another thing by night. But what's fab about our first room, which we call Anne's bedroom, is Simon found the presence of a little hole in the panelling that looks down into the Great Hall. And so it was a peephole for the family to spy on the servants setting up dinner, or for the girls who've maybe been sent to bed to spy on their parents entertaining the guests downstairs, which I think is such a great image.
Oh,
Because
I
I feel
love
like
it.
we've all been there as children, trying to, if we're sent to bed early, we're like, what's going on downstairs?
Yeah, with the adults. Yeah.
Exactly. So that's a really fun thing that we know now about that room, and we'd love to return it somehow to show that a window used to be there. And then the great chamber is the solar, as you mentioned, which is now our Books of Hours room. It's where we hold our Books of Hours, although they will be moving next year as part of our recuration, because we want to turn that great chamber back into something that the Boleyns would have recognised as they walked in, or as if they've just left. And that will involve fabulous new things like lots more tapestries. We want to really hang the walls with tapestries and arras. And I think often people think of Tudor furnishings as being quite dark, but really they were full of colour, especially if you could afford it. And we know the Boleyns at this point could. They've been full of rich patterns and rich colour. So lots of tapestries, and even a painted ceiling with maybe some gilding, but I won't say too much more on that. But
I mean, I think that's amazing, guys. We're going to actually get to see a recreated chamber of the Boleyns, as you were saying to me off camera, just as if they've all just walked out or gone hunting for the day. Or I think that's going to be awesome.
Definitely.
Well done. I think just a round of applause all
Thank
around.
you
I
for
think absolutely.
but it's we want to give that sense of all those important conversations that happened in these spaces. You know, this was where all those amazing conversations of the late 1520s happened. And I want to give that sense as you walk in that people have just been whispering in the corner, making decisions that are going to change the future of England.
It's amazing, actually, just as you were talking, and I'm thinking about that space and what you're saying about all these important conversations. It is quite amazing that the Boleyns, as their status grew, didn't spend more time at some of their much bigger properties, much grander properties. I know it's to do with privacy, or I think that's what the general, but it is quite astonishing. They must have loved Hever, because one thing Tudors were not shy about was owning big properties and showing off. Look at
Totally.
me. Look at the size of my house, you know.
Exactly. No, they did. And it was a status symbol as well to own these big houses. And the Boleyns certainly did. They owned, their property portfolio was really quite outstanding, combined with what Thomas inherited from both of his parents and then obviously Elizabeth as well. So their property portfolio was expansive. But I think Hever was quite unique amongst the bigger houses that they did own, in that, as you say, it was private, it was a retreat. I think was a safe space for all of them. And in terms of purpose for Thomas Boleyn, especially when he was on his diplomatic missions abroad in Europe, it was halfway point between Dover and London. So it totally makes sense as a location for them to have spent time in. And that's why we think that's primarily where Elizabeth raised the children whilst Thomas was abroad on his diplomatic missions, because it's that perfect distance between these important locations that they have to be in. But yes, secrecy and privacy, that's all what Hever was about.
Yeah, it's obviously mattered a lot. I'm going to bring this question in from Janice. So fantastic, i.e. the curation. How will you source the furniture and contents for the solar? Very good question, Janice.
Yes, really good question. Well, there's lots of big questions around that, and conversations that we're having about whether you have original furniture or replica furniture or somewhere in between. So maybe furniture made in the 19th century that's in the style of. And a lot of that depends on what aspects of the rooms we are able to have the public interact with. We are going to, as much as possible, go for that original furniture and original feel, but we also have to be aware as a heritage venue that we have thousands and thousands of people coming through our doors, and we have to protect whatever we do have. So if there are areas where visitors are passing through more or maybe need to sit down, we obviously can't have our oldest furniture there. So there's a lot of conversations around that happening at the moment, but it's primarily auction sites we are trawling through at the moment.
I bet you are. I bet you are.
Owen's a whiz on auctions, I have to say, but we are always keeping our eyes out for different pieces of furniture. And actually, we purchased one recently, and I won't say what it is, but we did get that from auction, and it's currently just being restored a little bit because it's very old. But that will be actually going in our Great Solar when we have that done up next year.
And you're opening more rooms, aren't you, for folks? So on that side, tell us about what's happening that's going to be accessible that's not currently accessible, if you can.
Yes, so without giving too much away, we are hoping to open up spaces, changing the shape of rooms. And again, a lot of this depends on last minute planning permission from places like historic England. But the rooms as much as possible to their original proportions, and also hopefully having a new peep in to a room, which is, we did consider putting completely on the visitor route, but it's a very, very small, tricky steps area that we think will probably be best kept as a little peep in. But that will be another room that's available to see, and that will definitely be happening, and that's off what will be the Great Chamber. So yes, so it will be expanded upon what we currently have. There'll be definitely more to see.
That's wonderful. But I am thinking about the other side. So as you said, the sort of west side is the family side. Now, at the moment, you've got the lovely Henry VIII bedroom. I'm pressing you, obviously, and you might not be able to say, in which case you're just going to say, I'm sorry, I can't say, Sarah. But I'm just wondering, are you going to leave those? Is that the intention, or what's going to happen there?
They will be changing as well. I can say that much. They will be changing. We probably won't be doing that next year, though. That will probably be the year after.
Right.
This year, that next year's it will be fully focused on the Boleyn's suite, because that is taking up a lot of time. So we want to do that justice before we move on to the other half of the floor. But it will be different to the Boleyn suite. We won't, if they weren't rooms that the Boleyns used, they would have been servants' dormitories. So we don't want to put something there that wasn't there before. We are trying to go back to what was originally there as much as possible. So they will look different. Both to what's there currently and also what will be opposite it on the other side of the castle.
Yeah. Very good, very good. So I think the final kind of question I've got about the castle is going back to Simon Thurley's research in the Long Gallery, because that's the other thing that came up, hasn't it, that's been so big. So maybe you could talk to us a little bit about that.
Yes, so this is a brilliant addition to our knowledge of Hever because it revolves around another of Henry's wives, and that is Anne of Cleves, wife number 4. And we love her at Hever. We always knew that she was a tenant of or an owner of Hever. At some point, we knew that she was here, or it was part of her property portfolio, because Hever was part of the portfolio given to her after her annulment to Henry. It was part of a very rich property portfolio. You know, she also had places like Richmond and Bletchingley and much grander houses than Hever. But what's brilliant we now know is that she added 3 key rooms to the castle, which was our entrance hall on the ground floor, our staircase gallery on the middle floor, and our long gallery, which, as you say, is one of our most impressive rooms, I think, and is one that visitors love and are always wowed at when they come in. So we used to think it was added by Thomas Boleyn, by Anne's father. And unfortunately, I think a lot of people have, imagined the Boleyns up there having a great time, but sadly it wasn't there while the Boleyns occupied the castle, but it was made by Anne of Cleves. And we think it was introduced by her in imitation of the great and grand long galleries she had in her other palaces. But when her portfolio was shortened by Edward after Henry died, Hever became really a primary residence for her, which hasn't been known or explored much before. And we have regular letters that she wrote from Hever, and she paid a sum of money for it to the crown to keep loaning it out. And so, yes, so we know that she added this place to entertain all her guests who came to stay, which she had a lot of. One of them I'd like to think, and there's no historical basis for this, but I'd love to think that young Elizabeth visited Anne
Well,
of Cleves.
Well, I'm glad you came to that because, of course, Fran asked that question in advance about did Elizabeth ever visit? So we don't know for sure, right?
Yes, we don't know for sure. There's no historical record, sadly. There were no guest books back then, sadly, where someone signed in when they arrived. So we have no current documentation that Elizabeth ever stayed. However, we think it is very likely that she at least came to visit once or twice. Both when Anne of Cleves lived there is a possibility because she was very close to Anne of Cleves and Anne to her as well. But also later, when she was queen, she visited Penshurst Place a lot, which is just around the corner from Hever. And it's where her close friend Mary Sidney lived there. And so we know that Elizabeth visited Penshurst on multiple occasions, and she would have had to go past Hever on her way to Penshurst. So knowing that it was the childhood home of her mother, and knowing that Elizabeth tried to feel close to her mother whenever she could, I just think, why would she not have just popped in even on the way through? She certainly would have seen it from afar. So we'd love to just find a letter somewhere that says, "Oh, I'm coming to Hever next week." That would be nice, but you never know.
Wouldn't it just? Oh, how frustrating. History can be so frustrating sometimes, can't it? But then it makes you all the more determined to keep searching and keep looking.
Exactly.
Can I ask, going back to just the long gallery? So, Fran, that's the answer to your question. We don't know, but almost certainly it seems highly probable that at some point she was there. The long gallery and Simon's work to pinpoint it to Anne of Cleves, what was the clinching evidence for that makes us believe that it's more kind of mid-16th century than very early 16th century?
So Simon is a bit of an expert in long galleries, and he has seen many, many, many long galleries over his career. And he felt when he came into the space that it was made slightly later than when we had assumed. So it was really through an intense case study comparison, really, to other the dates of other long galleries being made. If ours had been made when we thought it might have been originally, which was much earlier in the 16th century, it would have been quite unusual because long galleries were only becoming a fashion really later on, sort of 1520s onwards. So it makes much more sense, especially for a size of Hever, to be made a little bit later. But there's also evidence on the stonework outside the castle in terms of when You can date the patterns on the stonework too, and that all comes to around, more like the 1550s than anything.
Yeah, it's interesting. It just totally makes sense about the fashion. It was very early, wasn't it? 1505 is actually, when you think about it, very early for a long gallery.
Absolutely.
Very good. Okay. Well, oh my goodness. I think we're probably winding up. Gosh, we've only got 5 minutes max to go. So if you've got any absolutely burning questions, now's the time to slip those in while I ask Kate just to tell us summarize what's going on, what can be seen, anything that we need to know about, events that are going on. Tell us all about it.
Yes, thank you. So next week, again, that's our big one coming up soon, is next Thursday, the 8th of June. We are having a new item come in, and there'll be a lot, hopefully, of articles coming out about that. We've got some things in the pipeline. So you'll hopefully see a lot more about that on social media, where Owen and I have our research out and about. And we've also written, Owen and I, a book to accompany the loan coming next week. It's a slightly smaller book, mainly focusing just on this item and its provenance and the research attached to it and the implications that has. But that will also be available to buy from next Thursday, the 8th. And that will be at Hever Castle shop, both online and in store at Hever as well. So there'll be a lot coming around next week. And then obviously next year we will have the Boleyn suite launching upstairs in the middle floor of the castle. So that will be very much something to come and see if you at all can come and have a look around it in person. We are taking a break from exhibitions next year just so that we can focus on this project. But then the exhibition we're already planning for 2025 is also, I think, going to be quite a doozy. And the current exhibition book for Katherine and Anne is also available, Katherine and Anne, Queen's Rivals Mothers. That's available for purchase alongside our one from last year still as well, which is called Becoming Anne. So there's a few books out there that are available to have a look at, and hopefully you can come and have a look at the castle in person when we have things changing as well.
And the Boleyn wing will open when you open the castle for the new season next year. Is that the plan?
We don't yet have a confirmed date for it because we're waiting to hear on a couple of last minute things, but it should hopefully be around spring next year.
Yeah. And you're also doing a talk, aren't you and Owen, on the 2nd of August?
Yes, thank you. Yes, on the 2nd of August in the evening at Hever at their beautiful festival theatre, which, if you've not been, is just the most gorgeous venue. You've got the castle in the background behind you. So we are talking in the evening at about 8 p.m, I think, but the tickets to that are available on the Hever Festival Theatre website. And that is also going to be a book signing Owen and I will be doing. So absolutely, if anyone's coming down, we'd love to say hello.
Well, that's fantastic. Lots to look out for, ladies and gentlemen. Lots to look forward to as well. So keep your eye on social media next week when the big news comes out. But in the meantime, I first of all wanted to thank you, Kate, for taking an hour of your evening with us to be here this evening. I've thoroughly enjoyed myself, always do, talking to you and immersing myself in the world of Hever and the Boleyns, and no finer person to speak to. So thank you so much for that. And also thank you to the audience for being here today and sticking with us and chatting with us. We've appreciated that, haven't we, Kate?
We really have. It's lovely to have those questions coming in.
Thank you so much. So, ladies and gentlemen, of course, I'll be back as usual, probably in the first week of July. I don't think I've fixed a date yet, but I'm hoping, if I can remember correctly, that lovely Natalie Gruniger will be joining me. Actually, it's more Anne Boleyn. We're going to be talking obviously about her book, The Final Year of Anne Boleyn. So we'll be diving into all things Boleyn, and Natalie and I usually have a good time. So I hope you'll be prepared to tune in and join us. But look out for the time and the date, which will be coming up on the dashboard in the members site, obviously. I will change that around hopefully in the next week or so. So keep an eye open for that. Make sure you pop that in your diary. I'd love to see you live. And if anybody's just wondering, post masterclass that was held on Sunday, I'm about to send the email out with all the links to all the downloadables and also to the video for anybody who wants to catch up on that. So just keep an eye in your inbox for that. So once again, thank you folks out there. Thank you, Kate. And I'll see you guys next month. Bye.